Good morning or afternoon, depending on whenever you watch this Ed puzzle. As I'm filming this right now, it is indeed morning on the Friday where we received so much snow. Looking at my window now, there's probably about an inch on the ground. Cooper back here behind me, he saw his first snow. He was super excited about that. Ran around in circles for a few minutes. He's so excited. And speaking of exciting, this video is about the 1920s, a very, very exciting and time where we see a lot of change in American history. Okay, we have a lot going on. Women are starting to have a new role in society, more political freedom with the right to vote, more social freedom, things of that nature. We have parties and it's prohibition. This is the Great Gatsby. We'll talk about that. It's just like the night scene is insane during this time, and then it's the Jazz Age. This is a famous musician, Louis Armstrong. Some of you may have heard of him before, but all of these things define the 1920s. It was a very, very turbulent time, a time of a lot of change, um, and honestly, everything seemed to be going good. Now, the end of the 20s is when the economy went to shambles with the stock market crash, and the early 30s were the banks closing. But we'll get to the Great Depression next unit. So, listen, um, you do not necessarily have to write all this stuff down, okay? Because I will give you printed copies of these notes. The main thing I want you to do is just listen and answer the questions as this video plays, okay? So this gives you a nice little snapshot of all the things that we are going to talk about during this unit. Okay. We're really going to first focus on these first three bullets today. Okay. The politics and laissez-faire economy of the 1920s. The shift from everybody living in the cities now compared to the country and the nightlife of the cities, as well as the rise in consumer culture. Which that leads this third bullet leads us into our first thing for today. So consumer culture, okay, is basically where like people say that status is determined by how many things they have. Okay, and they desire to purchase material items. That is consumer culture. And so this is a written response. I'm just curious. In class, we would have a discussion about this. What are two luxuries that you would like to purchase someday? Like two things that like once you go to work and you've saved up some money, you want to have. Like think about some specific things because we all have. Like for me personally, I think I would love to have a hot tub, and I would love to have like a huge TV to watch college football. That's my two things. What are yours? And then, what do you think um, consumer culture is like in the United States today? Again, consumer culture being where like culture, society, and everything is defined by material possessions and who has what. Do you think that's a big part of our society today? People having the desire to buy goods and have stuff. They want stuff. They need stuff. What do you think of that? So answer that question. Okay, and then we're going to dive right in. So again, by 1920, okay, we see a massive population shift. Okay. Um, we have more Americans now living in cities than we do in rural areas for the first time in history. And there is a plethora of reasons for this factor. One of them is the Great Migration. Recall question: what was the Great Migration? Okay, so the Great Migration is a factor. When African Americans moved um, north from the south to seek jobs in cities at factories that were booming because of the war, World War One. And just in general, that's a common trend, right? Factories are running full capacity now. They're producing goods at record rates because of the adoption of Henry Ford's moving assembly line. Okay. And so it's just the cities are where the job opportunities are, right? And so that's why everybody is leaving the countryside and going to the cities. In the late 1800s, we saw this shift from us going from being like a farming society to an urban society, but we really see this in the 1900s. And we start to see skyscrapers and everything else. Okay. So, major demographic shift. Now, let's talk about the politics of the 1920s. Okay. Republicans, man, they were running the show. Okay. Which really, I'm going to talk about it here more in a second. um, really, like, even in the White House, like, since about 1868, just after the Civil War, Republicans have been in charge, and that was no different in the 1920s. But the Republicans do not just have the presidency or the White House. The Republicans control both houses of Congress and the Supreme Court. And so I want you to think real quick, why would it be, what might be the impact of this, of the fact that um, there's a Republican president and his party is in control of both houses of Congress, and there are also several Republican justices or conservative justices on the court. What might be the impact of that? And it's going to have an impact of any agenda that wants to be pushed is going to go through. Any law that wants to be passed is probably going to go through, and the Republicans are just going to be able to do whatever they need to and want to. Okay, now interestingly enough, the Supreme Court during this time is actually led by William Howard Taft, who, if you recall, was also a president, right? He was the dude that was president in between Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson. Okay. And interestingly enough, like I said, he's the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Taft actually preferred this role. He actually preferred this role compared to being in the presidency. Okay, which I'm curious because, again, I asked this question in class. What job would you rather do and why? Would you rather be a Supreme Court justice or would you want to be the president? Answer that. And then let's hop back to thinking about, again, all three branches are dominated by Republican leadership. What's the significance of that? Well, all of the government policies during this time, all the government policies during this time are going to favor the wealthy. They are going to favor businessmen and the rich. It's going to be laissez-faire capitalism all over again. Okay, and recall question here. Okay, we've talked about this a lot this year, but what is laissez-faire capitalism? Okay, that's an economy where the government's not really involved. So the 1920s, the politics and economy was dominated by Republicans. That was the politics, and the economy was booming. It was very like it was a climate where it favored. Oh, you want me to hold you? It was a climate where it favored the businessman, Mr. Cooper. It favored the businessman. Okay, favored the businessman. Now, moving on. So, unfortunately, the 20s also have a lot of government corruption. Okay, we're going to talk about Teapot Dome scandal here in a second, which occurred under the administration of President Warren G. Harding. And then we are going to talk about Prohibition next week, which was when alcohol was banned in the United States. Many people thought that that would help society and lower crime rate and issues, and it backfired big time. But we'll talk more about that in the coming weeks. Okay. So Warren G. Harding, you don't have to write this down or know this, but again, Republican leadership. Warren G. Harding was yet another Republican president. True, the United States had seen a strong Democrat president in Woodrow Wilson. But for the most part, in the past 70, 80 years at this point, or excuse me, my math is way off, about the past 50 or 60 years, Republicans have dominated the White House, and Warren G. Harding was yet another Republican president. Now, because of being a Republican and his cabinet being Republican, many of their policies were very like, the government should not get involved too much, right? And an idea that came out during this time is spare the rich policy, which you still kind of hear today. Elements of this were brought in and incorporated with Ronald Reagan's Reaganomics, and it's known as trickle-down economics. And here is what the spare the rich policy was. So when Harding appointed this guy, Andrew Mellon, to be who was the wealthiest man in America, to be the Secretary of the Treasury, Mellon came up with a policy that he thought would foster economic growth. Basically, he lowered the amount that the government would spend, okay, on things, like programs and stuff like that. So the amount of money that the government gives out. And he also gave tax breaks to the really wealthy, like corporate leaders and stuff. And again, this is known as spare the rich, okay? And excuse me. And the idea behind this, again, it's also, this is like elements of like trickle down economics, is that, think about it. Why might it be a good thing if wealthy factory owners and business owners do not have to pay as much in taxes. What's the logic there and how that could help the economy? Well, the logic or the argument is that because that they do not have as much expenses and taxes, they have more money in their pocket that they can spend on maybe paying their workers a little bit more, and they can spend on expanding their business, growing their business, buying more plants, more factories, producing more goods, whatever. Okay, it's the idea that if they have more money in their pocket, that's going to stimulate economic growth. Historians are kind of torn on whether or not the effectiveness of these policies is. On one hand, during the 20s, the economy did extremely well, right? We grew, people were spending, and everything seemed to be going great. But it also, at the end of the decade, it crashed and we went into the Great Depression. I'm not saying that was all Mellon's fault, but the jury is kind of still out and trying to figure out just the effectiveness of this policy. Some think it helped the economy overall. Some really felt like it was just a break to the wealthy people. Now, the Hardin presidency, okay? Hardin picked really bad friends to run the Oval Office with them. And because Hardin's presidency, when we look back on it today, like I guarantee most of you have never even heard of Warren G. Harding. But at the time, he was actually a really popular president 100 years ago. But then scandal after scandal after scandal came out during his administration. And in many cases, Harding was not directly involved, but it's people who were part of his cabinet, people that he had appointed, his friends. Okay, and most were related to taking bribes and things like that, or like evading money, paying money on things and stuff like that. The oil scandal, okay, at Teapot Dome. Interesting. I like this cartoon. See, it's a teapot and it's like a steamroller. But it says oil skin on it, and it's chasing people back to the White House, implying this thing goes all the way back to the White House, and it did. So Teapot Dome was a scandal involving oil that involved a cabinet member of Warren G. Harding. In other words, a like an advisor to President Warren G. Harding. And you're like, okay, why is it called Teapot Dome? Well, the oil that was involved in this case was located in an area called Teapot Dome out in Wyoming, which has a rock formation that looks like this. Kind of looks like a teapot. As you can see, there's the little spout. Okay. Now, with the Teapot Dome scandal, okay, Albert Bacon Fall was the Secretary of the Interior at the time. And he decided that he was going to take 2 government oil reserves and put it under the control of his department. Now, the government has oil for a variety of reasons, right? They have it for military purposes. They might have it in case there's a dip in the global market. But he took 2 of those oil reserves and put it under his control. Nothing illegal about that, right? The next part is, okay, after that, Fall took a bribe from businessmen and sold this government oil that was government property and belonged to the government to these private oil companies, okay, for $500,000. Okay, this is discovered. This issue comes to light. Fall is convicted of this crime and he is sent to jail. And this is significant because this is the only time, or excuse me, not the only, the first time ever that a active member of the president's cabinet is arrested for a crime committed while in office. So when this comes to light, obviously President Hardin's popularity dips because this was his guy, somebody who worked for him, and then Warren Hardin dies. And then Calvin Coolidge becomes president. Now, real quick, answer that question about Teapot Dome before we go to Calvin Coolidge. Now, Calvin Coolidge, okay, if Hardin believed in laissez-faire, Coolidge believed in even more so, like an extreme version. He was less involved and less active than Hardin. He believed that businessmen should basically have the government, like run the government. They should have a say, given that the economy is doing so well at this time. And Coolidge was just one of those guys that is just very distant, right? Like there's not a ton of great things about him. There's not really a ton of bad things about him, but he's just kind of like a mid president. But this is kind of funny. An ice cream parlor helped him advertise for his re-election campaign. Look, the slogan says "Keep cool with Coolidge," which is kind of cool. No pun intended. But Coolidge was very not cold-hearted necessarily, but just kind of, like I said, kind of distant. He wasn't really a man of the people, so to speak. He didn't talk to people a lot. There's a story or legend that says that there was a party at the White House one time, and this man came up to Coolidge and said, "I bet somebody that I can get you to say more than 3 words, and I think I'm going to win." All Coolidge said is, "You lose," and he walked away, which is very, very humorous, but that was Calvin Coolidge to a T. Now, Herbert Hoover was much more involved, and Herbert Hoover was what you call a go getter. Okay. Hoover, whenever he was nominated for the presidency by the Republican Party in the late 20s, he was the Secretary of the Commerce. So everybody saw him as being like the MVP, right? Being Secretary of the Commerce, he's in charge of trade and everything like that. And the economy at the time is doing fantastically well. And so everybody sees him as being the guy that can continue to propel us to excellence, right? Keep this gravy train going. And so he's seen as quote unquote a champion of business competition. And Hoover's background is actually really interesting. He was a millionaire by the time he was age 40 after really not coming from a privileged background. But by age 40, he was a millionaire. And he also had an engineer mind. He had a problem solver mind. He actually had an engineering degree from Stanford University, one of the more prestigious colleges in the United States. And so many are like, Hoover's our guy. The economy is going to keep going great, and we have nothing to worry about. And then, yes, about a year, or not even a year into Hoover's presidency, we see the stock market crash. And a few months after that, all the banks start to shut down. And into the Great Depression we go. All right. Give me 1 second, please. Cooper. There's boxes under the bed. Like empty boxes, and he likes to chew on them. So making sure he doesn't ingest any carbon. You're going to stay right here. Good boy. All right. Now, so during the 20s, we see an increase in consumer culture. Okay, massive increase. There's, again, because of the moving assembly line, we have goods being produced, things being invented that have never been that readily available to people before, and now they are. Okay, and it's things that you wouldn't think about that greatly improve the lives of everybody, like vacuum cleaners, refrigerators, and radios. Like, we don't think about like vacuum cleaners being that big of a deal today, but at the time it was everything. Forgot to put it on here, but washing machines are another thing that becomes readily available during this decade. People are buying goods that frees them up, right? And that is why during the 20s, employers are trying to keep workers happy, so the work hours are cut, but also in their everyday life, people aren't having to work as much. You're not having to go home and hand wash clothes and hang them out on a line if you have a washing machine. Vacuum cleaners are speeding up the process of getting dirt off your floor. Okay, it's just little things, and that's a big reason why people have more free time during the 20s. And baseball games are popular, and boxing matches are popular, and theater is popular, and dancing is popular, all these different things. Unemployment rate very low. Again, the economy is booming, so jobs are readily available, but this number is quickly going to flip. Okay, during the Depression, we'd reach a point where really the vast majority of people are out of work or working very, very low, menial paying jobs. Okay, but all of this consumer culture, again, it seems like things are going great. People have jobs, people are buying goods that make their everyday life easier, but the concept of credit becomes popular for Americans at this time. And you can see how this is going to be a problem by the end of the decade. Okay, because people want the stuff and they need the stuff and they have to have the stuff. They want the vacuum cleaner, they want the radio, they want the washing machine. Problem is, they don't necessarily have all the money to buy it. Hey, no big deal, you know. You can just pay it off. You see this in this advertisement for this vacuum cleaner, right? $2 down and you pay $3 a month. Okay, so like there were like layaway payment plans, stuff like that, and just traditional credit. The problem is that many people bought so many different goods. They had so many different things going on that they couldn't pay it back. And, credit card debt is still a big problem today. People sometimes let that get out of hand. And the problem was during the 20s, the vast majority of Americans did. And by the end of the decade, we had what was like a bubble of credit of, people, loans and credit that people had taken out. And it's just waiting to burst on the whole economy. But we'll get to that when we get to the Depression. Okay. But even though people were buying things on credit, again, they were readily available because of better production. Okay, like we see this with cars specifically. So, like, here's a graph of Ford Motors, and you see the green line represents how many cars they were producing. Okay, and then um, the blue represents the average cost of car. What's the common trend that you see with this graph here? When you look at it, again, the blue represents the cost of a car. The green represents how many cars are being produced. What's the general trend that you see? As the production goes up, the cost is going down, right? You see this from 1908, a car was $950 roughly, and now it's less than 300 just 15, 16 years later, which I would love either of those prices on cars today. But this is significant, okay? And this logic is applied to many different goods, not just cars. But Ford did take off during the 20s, and they have the moving assembly line. They're producing cheaper, more efficient goods, and it leads to goods like cars being more affordable to the American people. Excuse me, come here. Cooper. There we go. We're gonna have to stay there for a second. All right, and it leads to goods like cars being more affordable and readily available to the American people. Good boy. Now, this is our last really thing we're going to focus on today, okay? During World War I, what had farmers done? Okay, what were farmers encouraged to do? And what were they encouraged to do? They were encouraged to produce as many crops as humanly possible, okay? Now, they had produced all these crops to help feed the soldiers overseas, and then they obviously made a decent amount of chunk change out of this. They decided to invest in themselves, right? They used that money to buy more acres, more equipment, because they want the hopes of expanding their operation, having higher yields, where they have bigger profits. Okay, you'll see the answer in a second. I want you to take a guess at this next multiple choice question. Okay, why is this going to be a problem? Okay, farmers are continuing to produce at the same level that they were during the war. Okay, it's after the war now, and not just after World War One. It's also after a worldwide epidemic known as pandemic, known as the Spanish flu. Okay, that killed millions. World War One killed millions, and so if farmers keep producing at the same levels they were during the war, when the population of the world was a little bit more, what is the issue going to be if they keep producing at those same levels? And it's this: farmers outpace the demand. They overproduce. They produce too much. There's only so many crops or only so much meat that a person can buy, right? And if you produce more than what the general population needed, the price of those commodities or those goods is going to go down, right? It's, again, law of supply and demand. The problem is the prices dropped so low, okay, the market dropped so low that farmers were not really making money. Even though they were producing a ton, they were making pennies on the dollar, so they were losing money, and then they were in debt. Because a lot of these things, okay, they may have made enough money to buy acres and get this equipment to try to have a higher output. They had some of the money to do these things. They didn't have all of it. They took out loans. And we're going to see in the Depression, the banks are going to have to foreclose on several farms because of this. Okay, so even before the Depression hits, the 20s is not the rest of society is dancing and going to parties, and it's the jazz age and boxing matches and all these great things, washing machines, and just a great time. Farmers are already struggling. This is what I like to call the pre-depression depression for farmers. Okay, and we'll talk more about this when we review, and also it'll come back again at the Depression. So again, farming during the 20s, we have a lot more new technology, but the problem is that this new technology, the tractors, things of this nature, enabled farmers to produce more, which was good, but they produced too much, more than what the population needed. Prices go in the crapper, and farmers don't make any money. Okay, that is it. Please type any questions that you may have, thoughts, concerns. Thank you, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.